Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I think there's too great an expectation maybe set on them to be, these perfect role models. We don't find that in any profession, clergy or business world or any place else. How could we demand that of the athletes, especially when they aren't trained for that?
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and teacher. Father Bacik and Mr. Sibley will discuss sports and role models. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Ernie, sports rap is in. We got Costas Coast to Coast, and certain people like to listen in on sports rap.
Joe Franklin, for instance, in New York.
Yeah, it's quite a phenomenon. And so let's do a little sports rap.
Okay,
talk about
sports junkies here together.
That's right. Part of our common bonding, a history of sports, of interest in sports, and of being those who have failed in many ways, have learned our sense of limitation by learning we would never be as good as we wanted to be, or even as we thought we were at one time.
Exactly.
So that's one thing about sports. It does raise that whole limitation question and failures eventually, and then when that happens, we have to find our way around it. And I'd like to look at sports in terms of role models and sports heroes and heroines, people that we look up to. And maybe that is an interesting phenomenon in itself, why we would do that. I mean, throughout our history in the United States, we've had the great figures who have been heroes. We go back to John Sullivan and the heavyweight champion, and figures like Babe Ruth. I mean, really become cultural heroes.
Absolutely. Even in this day and age where it seems that politically it's hard to make heroes out of our presidents, for instance, I still find I'm able to make heroes out of sports figures, and that some cases are 25 and 30 years younger than I, and I'm startled by that. But in terms of their sheer performance at their chosen sport, for me, tremendously admirable and worth emulating.
It's funny how passionate that gets. If I think back over my own life, I remember one of my first baseball heroes was Vern Stevens, because he played shortstop for the St. Louis Browns. I mean, there wasn't much lower than the St. Louis Browns in some of those years.
But he won the home run title one year,
He played very well. He had a lot of RBIs. He later went with the Red Sox and had a lot of RBIs. But, I mean, I can remember getting up in the morning and looking at the batting score. What do I say? The box score, and looking and see how many hits he got. And then I had a paper that I would calculate what his average was, so I knew it on a day-to-day basis. I'd look at the box score and then figure out my math and work out what his batting average was at the time. So it brings out to me, the passion that some people at least, everyone probably thinks that's crazy, but the passion that some people bring to the sports hero.
Exactly. Tommy Harmon was my first football hero, and I had never been west of Pittsburgh. And to root for somebody that played for the University of Michigan seems very common to people in Ohio, this part of Ohio now. But for a little boy back in Connecticut, that was pretty unusual. But I remember he made a movie, and I went to see the movie 3 times. And everything he did, he married Elise Knox, a movie star. So my passion was I would also marry a movie star because Tommy Harmon married.
You were out there in the East looking at the West. It's interesting, in the fight song of the University of Michigan, it talks about the champions of the West. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, yes, that
Ann
is.
Arbor, champions of the West. That gave some perception of how sports fans in the East viewed the rest of the world. Well, remember, we didn't have Major League Baseball out in the West Coast for so long.
Of course not.
It was an Eastern phenomenon.
Until O'Malley became a traitor and took my Dodgers away. Walter,
right.
Wherever you are, I have something to say to you about that.
Some Brooklyn fans have never forgotten him for that.
I used to go down to Dodger Stadium about 4 times a year from Connecticut, and had the lineups memorized and the batting averages. And Duke Snider was my particular hero, as well as Jackie Robinson. But I like the Dodgers even back to when Mickey Owen dropped the 3rd strike, and I was 7 years old at that time, and I was heartbroken. It was in recollection my first experience of massive pain and nothing to do with it and nobody to talk to. It didn't diminish my heroes. It just hurt me to realize that heroes don't always win.
Yeah. It sets up a competitive thing, too. I remember my next hero, I think, was Joe DiMaggio playing for the Yankees. I went to a winner for some reason along the way from Vern Stevens. And one of the passions at that time was that Joe DiMaggio had to be better than Ted Williams. And a more valuable player. And I can remember searching the records to see ways in which his records was superior to Ted Williams. I remember there's another kid in the neighborhood who Williams was his hero. And of course he often had the stats on his side and could prove his point because Williams' batting average was really higher, lifetime, and so on. And so that competitive thing came into the whole picture of heroes as well for me.
Oh, absolutely. Jim Brown was a big hero of mine when he played fullback number 32 for the Cleveland Browns. And I remember really having a bad day when Walter Payton broke Jim Brown's rushing record. And I must have been 52 years old when that happened. But Jim Brown is, forevermore shall be, the ultimate running back. And Walter Payton, I tried to find ways of justifying because my hero was now not in first place. Difficult.
Now that raises a clear distortion that comes into a lot of our perceptions of sports, and that revolves around the question of competition and the way competition gets sort of out of bounds. So in our culture as a whole, there's this great competitive urge. There's the need to be number one. The problem is often that is taken from the world of sports and put into other situations where we want to rate human beings on certain qualities, and where it can get in the way of relationships, where people can become domineering, can use bad tactics in order to be number one. We think of the college scene and the recruiting violations we hear about, and then we're saddened by the scandals that have come into sports, the basketball scandals that touched many of us when collegiate players had taken money to throw games.
Oh, absolutely.
And so on.
I remember Long Island University
Right.
way back in the 50s.
And of course that happened at the University of Toledo too, in that same era there. And it's very true.
Well, you were far west then, so I didn't know that
right.
much about the far west. It's fascinating how we've assimilated sports values into our culture, and then have the problems when we run into the corruption. But I remember during his lifetime, Vince Lombardi being the most popular motivational speaker for business groups and using his sports jargon. And something that sticks with me today is his saying, "Show me a good loser and I'll show you a loser." And that's rather unfortunate, but I've assimilated that into my value system, and I've been a loser, and I hope I've been a good loser. And yet that statement, that value, suggests that a good loser is purely and simply a loser.
It's good when we see counter images to that, I think. There's an image of when the Pistons beat the Celtics in the NBA playoff of McHale spending just a few seconds with Isaiah Thomas and evidently congratulating him and wishing him well in the further playoffs and so on. Or when cities have celebrations for teams that have been defeated, even though they are not number one, but saying, hey, we appreciate what you've done and so on. That's happened in sports various times where the crowd present will applaud the losing team at the end for the hometown losing team.
I agree, though my own experience is I'm a much more gracious winner and certainly willing to applaud the losers when I'm winning. I'm also aware of how patronizing I can be if I beat you at golf and tell you, well, you really hit the ball very well, Jim. I've never seen you play better. Since I beat you, then that, of course, implies that I was even better than you were. So I'm not always sure how authentic winners congratulating losers. I think it was neat when Detroit turned out that many people. But
to welcome the Pistons after they lost to the Lakers?
Back. Yeah. But I'm still nervous from my youth about living comfortably and cheering for being a loser.
Yeah, and again, it shows the power of sports to influence our outlook, and in this case, that competitive urge surely can get out of line and distort our thinking. And I suppose, it would, a healthier attitude maybe would be to say, well, DiMaggio was very good. He was a graceful center fielder and a fine hitter, and therefore I could look up to him, that he didn't really have to be better than Ted Williams in every area. Maybe there's a healthier way to think about these heroes that would then go back onto our own relationships and say, well, it's all right, you have your way of operating and you bring your contributions to the general public good here, and I make mine, and we're happy about that. We can live with a sense of complementarity and celebrating our differences and seeing how we all fit together. So maybe we could have the heroes, but DiMaggio doesn't have to be better than Williams in every way.
Agree. That's certainly possible. I have to wonder what in the world you did with Joe DiMaggio's marriage to Marilyn Monroe and subsequent divorce.
Well, I'll tell you about it. It's interesting, and I could probably play that off further about my own heroes and what did not bother me. I was never interested in my heroes in their personal life. Al Kaline became my next great hero, and I mean to an excessive degree, no doubt. And I understand that psychologically, and I want to talk about that for a minute. If I might as well do that now.
Yes.
But I mean, Al Kaline was 1 year older than I was, graduating from high school, about approximately. And it was right around that time in my life that I realized I would never be a ball player, between my junior and senior year of high school, when I finally started to grow, but my skills didn't develop, and I knew right away that I'd never be any good. And but here comes Al Kaline out of a high school in Baltimore and is signed immediately to the Detroit Tigers, never plays in the minors, come into the major leagues, and leads the league in hitting. I mean, it's
what a great substitution for you.
Exactly the right word. Exactly the
yes.
right word. There is the clear substitution. In other words, for 22 years, Al Kaline carried on for me. And for 22 years, I checked the box scores to see how I did that last night.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And it was so clear, the psychology of it. I mean, no mystery about it at all. Here, I could never be a ball player, and here was a guy who came out and did all of this. And I mean, there was passion with that about when Kaline would get a hit. I remember one time when he hit a home run in the World Series. I mean, I thought I was going to jump through the TV set or something watching it. And then I remember watching the World Series when he got a key hit in Game 5, I think it was, and I mean, just going crazy in the stands because I had finally come through in the crucial.
This was your moment of glory. Oh,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So what happens, it seems like, with these role models and these figures is that they carry on for us. But to complete my point, and I want to stay with it for a while, but I was never interested in Al Kaline's personal life, just like it didn't bother me that Joe DiMaggio was in the relationship with Marilyn Monroe and it broke up.
Had nothing to do.
I didn't want to meet Al Kaline, really, and I didn't want to get his autograph, and I didn't want to have a personal conversation with him or ask him what made him tick and how he was such a good ball player. What was important to me was his performance on the field. And in fact, it hurts me to this day that he batted .297 and not .300 for his lifetime, and that he hit 399 home runs and not 400.
If you tried a little harder, Jim, then you could have made it to those levels.
Yes, he would have made 400 home runs. He had 399. I watched the last game that he played in Tiger Stadium. I was a handful of people there, and to the last out, I'm waiting for him to hit that 400th home run. And then the terrible thing of all, in the 6th inning, the manager takes him out for a pinch hitter when he still had 2 more tries to hit the 400th home run.
How could he do that?
Now Kaline himself didn't care if he hit 4 home runs,
did.
but I did.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
Now, you say you went straight from DiMaggio to Kaline.
Well, there might have been someone else in there. I don't remember.
Because I had the experience, since the Dodgers were my team, that some hot rookies that came up through spring training, I attempted to make into role models, and then they lasted for 3 months of the season. I think of Rex Barney as a very fast a guy who must have thrown about 100 miles per hour, and his fastball had no control. But I made a hero out of him, sort of a role model, and I tried to emulate his pitching style. And he kept getting wilder and wilder and wilder. He did throw 1 no-hitter, but he walked 12 people in the no-hitter. And my role model just wasn't cutting it, and here I was struggling to find another role model.
Did the other team score in that no-hit game?
Yes.
Did they really?
The Dodgers won 5-2. against the Boston Braves at that time.
It's remarkable the memory quality here, isn't it? To be able to think back to those situations. And I see mine isn't as sharp anymore. My memory has faded on a lot of those things. But the emotional tone of it seems to stay with me, like those big events when K-Line came through, and then, boy, that was marvelous, and I can still feel those, although some of the details have escaped me.
Absolutely. The week before last, my wife and I were up in Montreal for a 4-day weekend, and this is our 4th year in Montreal. I have found I have a particular affinity for Montreal, and then it occurred to me that when I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, Montreal was the #1 farm team for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Sam Jethro, Roy Campanella, etc. played for Montreal. And I think some of my affinity 40 years later is because Montreal was the #1 Dodger farm team.
Let's talk a little bit about, possible distortions in all of this thing. I mean, it's possible with all this role model and heroines and sort of the substitution factor, as you quickly noted, could get out of bounds. I mean, it seems like you could live through someone else's life instead of living your own. You could think of, I think the dangers perhaps of youngsters who are in the ghetto and don't, have great problems economically, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to move them ahead in the society. So if they put their mind on a pro basketball player, Bill Russell or Oscar Robertson or somebody, and say, this is my way out of the ghetto,
it's
then
basically unrealistic.
Or Mike Tyson. I mean, it's so unrealistic because it's such a tiny percentage of people who ever make it that big. And so in one sense, I think that the role model business here can hurt. It can put someone on a false path here that has no substance to it. So that would be one distortion, at least, that would seem to me. Well, we got to talk to those kids and say, hey, you can only make it by going through school. I remember our paper boy being a very large young man, and obviously, with loving sports. And every time I would see him, I would say to him, are you studying? Remember, that's how you're going to make it. Are you studying? What are you doing in school? And that was my constant refrain from him, because I felt that danger that here's this big kid thinking he's going to be another basketball star and escape from his economic situation in that fashion. And who knows if he ever
His name
would.
was Michael Jordan, wasn't it? And I think he plays for the Chicago Bulls.
Yes, right.
Yes. No, it's truly an interesting phenomenon. I get concerned. Kids from any situation have the right to hope. At what point does it become a destructive and an unrealistic hope? I'm sure my own fantasies became unrealistic and potentially destructive in terms of being as good as my role model. At some point, my role model's victories absolves me of the responsibility also, on the other hand, of having my own personal victories. I can exude my energy through the role model, and when K-Line bats .340, then perhaps you're absolved from studying as hard as you should.
It certainly could happen that way. And on the other hand, it is also true that we need the role models, and we hope that somehow that for the youngsters that they come forth as being healthy ones. I saw an article not long ago in a paper. Someone was knocking some of the current sports figures who are involved in drugs and so on, and saying what terrible role models we have. Let's get back to the good old days when we had Babe Ruth as our role model. Now, people who know about Babe Ruth was famous for some of his carousing and
all
habits.
Of his carousing.
That,
hit many home runs with a hangover and sleepless nights the night before, and one or several young ladies.
It shows how the cultural memory worked, though. Babe Ruth now was a clean role model, whereas, as a matter of fact, at the time, people were saying the same things to their kids. Don't act like Babe Ruth here.
I'm sure that people rooting for the Yankees in the 50s and 60s rooted for Billy Martin, rooted for Mickey Mantle, rooted for Whitey Ford. And then Jim Bouton's Ball 4 came out, and we recognized that on the playing field they were heroic, but at the Coca-Cabana at 4 a.m. in the morning they were something less than heroic.
It's really a sense to demand too much of them, isn't it? To be saints. I mean, they're ball players. When they're playing ball, they're young. and that's absorbing to them, and there's all kind of pressures upon them and so on. I mean, it's really asking them too much of them to be moral role models. I mean, I think it's great when the athletes get on television and tell the youngsters don't do drugs. I mean, I have to think there's at least some youngsters out there who, when Michael Jordan says don't do drugs, listen to him in a way that they won't listen to somebody else, and I'm all for that. But I think there's too great an expectation maybe set on them to be, these perfect role models. We don't find that in any profession, clergy or business world or any place else. So how could we demand that of the athletes, especially when they aren't trained for that?
That's a good point. I'm aware that today, and through most of my life, one of my first role models as a baseball player was Jackie Robinson. And interestingly enough, the fact that he was black was irrelevant. He was skilled, he was an energy center, he helped my Dodgers win, and it was easy for him to be my role model. In professional golf, it's easier for me to identify with some of the good women players. Sure, I identify with Nicklaus or with Hogan earlier, but realistically, they are in a totally different league than I could ever conceive of being, whereas Nancy Lopez, that seems accessible to me. So role models, at least from my point of view, don't have to be the same color or the same gender. It's more the skill level than anything else.
Yeah,
aspiring to that skill level. Or, in Joe DiMaggio's case, his grace.
Yeah. I loved the way he did things. That was important to me, that he did it with such gracefulness and the stance at the plate and the way he caught the fly balls. All of that was very important to me. It represented some sort of high ideal of physical ability or the way that one ought to deal with the world.
Exactly. One thing I do remember, Teddy Williams, the splendid splinter, talking about integrity. I never admired Teddy Williams very much until they developed the Williams shift, where they put all the infielders to the right side between second and first base, and he refused to compensate and hit down the third baseline. And I thought, that's a beautiful amount of integrity. He will now be one of my heroes.
Uh-huh. Williams, you mentioned him, and although DiMaggio was my hero, I never felt the electricity as when Williams came to the plate, even though I was, this great DiMaggio fan. The times when I saw Ted Williams play and come to the plate, there was nothing like it. I've never seen any other hitter that did that for me. When he would come up and paw with that back foot and make that...
Seemed to carry his own aura to the plate
yes,
with him. I think of Jimmy Brown in the backfield.
Oh.
And watching all the defensive players sort of aim toward Jimmy because he was the one they had to worry about.
Right. So style seems to be part of what we look for in the heroes. I want to pick up on the Jackie Robinson thing. Well, you said that Jackie Robinson, who broke in with the Dodgers in 1947, was not a real, it didn't make any difference to you that he was black and you were white. He was your hero or functioned that way. I was thinking that he did play a tremendously positive role for the black community, however, to be the first to break in.
Oh, of course.
And to show that it could be done. We think of all the great players who played in what they called in those days the Negro Leagues and who were outstanding. Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige through most of his career and so on, who never got that chance. I mean, terrible discrimination in our culture. And then to have a man finally break through and to put up with everything he did, it was horrible. And yet he was able to do that with style and with grace and had such a flair and so on. It was a beautiful thing. So, I mean, I think many black youngsters saw that as hey, we can break into the culture. I think it had a larger cultural meaning than just the baseball thing. So I think for the black youngsters, he was a hero precisely because of color in a way that it didn't function for you.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I have no comparative experience as a white male. The role models usually were white and male, so readily accessible to me. And while I'm sure I experienced exclusion. In terms of role models, I was never excluded.
Right.
I had the whole world available to me.
I think this would be a good thing, too, with young women in our culture now having female role models in the sports world to look up to. And people who, Cheryl Miller in the basketball world and so on.
Nancy Lieberman, right.
And this begins to make a difference, I think. It encourages them that they can do it, and that maybe gets them more interested, gets them participating more. So instead of being mere spectators or cheerleaders for the boys' games, that they have their ways, of participating.
They have choices, right.
That's right. That seems very important in the culture as a whole.
Absolutely.
So, Ernie, we're talking all about role models here. Is there anything that we didn't get in here that you wanted to say? Or shall I?
I can't really imagine having grown to be age 54 without having experienced role models, sports role models.
I guess part of what we've talked about, our personal history in this regard, I go through my list of Vern Stevens and Joe DiMaggio and Al Kaline, who carried on for me for 22 years. And it becomes a very personal thing. It'd be interesting to see what sort of universal message that carries, whether, people listening to that can find their own role models. Maybe some people find it in the world of music or ballet or the theater or other public figures, the world of politics and so on. But I'm convinced that we need those. We have to feel that there's people who have made it, who carry certain virtues. They don't have to be perfect, but what they carried for me very often was style and grace, and they had skill, bodily skill, things that were beautiful to behold. And it seems to me that's something indeed worth celebrating.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and teacher. The topic of this week's Reflections was sports and role models. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.